I'm Nora Bennett, 36, and tonight my nursing bag hit my parents' basement floor harder than it should have. It echoed off cinder block walls and the hiss of a dehumidifier like a reminder of where I've landed. 2 twin beds sit in a tight row by the water heater quilts, folded neat as if neatness could fix air that tastes like dust and soap. A purple clarinet case rests on a concrete ledge, and Mason's inhaler log peeks from a box labeled books, the edges curled by damp. Upstairs, a baby laughs, bright and easy, and the sound drifts through the ceiling joists like a bell I can't ignore. My name rises from the stairwell. Mom's voice warm for the baby and thin for me, and I think about what the word temporary has meant in this house. The truth is simple and heavy. My children are sleeping below ground, and someone decided that for us. I stand there long enough to feel the chill work through my shoes. I don't call out. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to draw a line so your kids wouldn't get pushed behind someone else's comfort. I grew up in a town where the highway slows before it crosses the river, where every school sport got a banner hung from the fence, whether we won or not, and where my mother taught us to bring a casserole when words ran out. My father built porches and mended roofs, and his pride lived in things that didn't leak. Ours lived in being the kind of people who showed up. We weren't rich, but the house was steady, and the rules were simple: work hard, say thank you, treat family like a safe harbor. I believed that long after I started working nights on a med-surg floor, and long after my marriage came apart at the seams. When the decree was signed and the apartment keys went back across a counter, I told Mason and Lila we'd come stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a little while. The words fit in my mouth because I needed them to. I told the kids they'd keep their same school, their same friends, and their rooms would be upstairs, sun warming the hardwood first thing in the morning. The first week under my parents' roof reminded me how soft habits form when a baby is in the house and how sharp edges grow on everything else. Paige moved into my old room with Owen, and the hallway filled with bottle racks and a white noise machine that hummed like a borderline apology. My mother kept saying, "He's our first," in a way that meant both miracle and assignment, and the house bent around his naps like it was the weather. Lila learned to slide her clarinet back into its case at the first squeak of a floorboard above, and Mason learned to breathe shallow on the couch when the humidifier clicked off eyes on me like I had the answer. I covered extra grocery runs, took every overtime shift I could get, and told myself this was the right kind of hard family making room for family, just until I got bearings, just until something opened on the right street. Dana Ruiz, my charge nurse, saw the circles under my eyes before I did, and handed me coffee in the break room without asking questions. "You're carrying 3 people on your back," she said, holding the door with her hip while I balanced a stack of charts. "Make sure you don't forget the one with the badge." I laughed because that's what we do in the hospital. We make the next right move and then another, and sometimes we lean on a sentence until our legs feel like legs again. I started keeping a notebook in my scrub pocket, shifts, covered savings tally, school forms, and at the bottom of the page, I wrote the same line each night: find sunlight. I didn't know it would become a promise, but I knew I needed one. On good days, I pictured a small apartment with a patch of morning light on a kitchen table. On tired days, I pictured a door that locked behind us and windows that opened all the way. There's the difference no one taught me to name the stretch between what we believe a home should be and what it turns into when everyone's needs get stacked like chairs after a church supper. My parents loved the baby with their whole attention. They loved my kids too, but in a narrower space, love with elbows tucked in. Paige was trying to keep her work afloat between feedings and the kind of quiet that makes you borrow other people's patience. I understood more than I said. Still, the house began to separate us into categories. I heard it in how nap became law, how just for now began to mean get used to it, how my father's voice set the table for what came next without asking if we had enough chairs. I watched my children measure themselves against the sound of a sleeping baby and the click of my mother's tongue when Lila's laugh carried too far. I heard my son's cough get thicker when the weather turned, and I told myself it was a cold. The night it shifted, I came home between storms, the sidewalks shiny and the trees dripping like a slowed-down metronome. The kitchen light was still on. Paige's laptop sat open beside a bottle brush and a folded dish towel, its screensaver just starting to dim. Upstairs, Owen babbled, and my mother's voice floated down soft with that syrupy patience she saved for him. I set my bag down by the basement door and felt the house like a set I knew by heart, every creak in its old bones familiar as a lullaby. I was ready to tiptoe, to pour water quietly, to move like gratitude. Then I saw a corner of Lila's lavender quilt, peeking from a plastic tub at the top of the stairwell, and beyond it, the neat line of boxes with my children's names. My father's hammer lay on the counter, and the living room held an extra rocking chair that hadn't been there in the morning. From the hallway, a soft ping rose from Paige's laptop, a message landing like a pebble dropped in a sink of water, and I realized something was being arranged in this house, whether I said yes to it or not. I stayed still long enough to hear my own breathing, and the steady drip from a coat hung too wet by the door. The tomorrow I'd been promising my kids felt closer than it had an hour earlier, and for the first time in weeks, the word temporary meant a choice I could make, not a corner I'd been pushed into. I turned toward the basement to find their quilts and books, and the floorboards above me answered with the hush that comes right before a decision. When the laptop pinged again, brighter this time, I knew the next conversation wouldn't sound like a favor being offered. It would sound like a plan already made. I set my hand on the newel post at the top of the stairs and told myself to breathe because the next thing I was about to learn would either be a misunderstanding or proof. The glow from Paige's laptop dimmed just enough for the screen to reveal the last message thread. I hadn't meant to read it, but my eyes caught on my own children's names. 3 weeks earlier, Paige had written to a friend, "Mom said we can just put them in the basement. Nora works too much to notice, and Mason and Lila are used to making do." The words blurred for a moment, followed by strings of laughing emojis from the other side of the conversation. My stomach tightened as I realized this hadn't been a spur-of-the-moment choice. It was something they'd quietly planned while I took double shifts cooking their meals and keeping Owen fed on my days off. I closed the laptop gently as I heard Owen cry upstairs, Carol's soft voice moving through the hall to soothe him. My hand trembled when I reached for the water glass on the counter, careful not to turn as Paige's footsteps creaked toward me. Still up, she asked, her voice, even as if nothing about the house had shifted. "Mom's with him. He's teething." I nodded, my words sounding strange to my own ears when I answered. "I know. I've been giving him teething tablets during my shifts." Her eyes flickered over my face for a second, but she didn't linger. She simply turned away and carried her mug back upstairs, leaving me in the quiet hum of the refrigerator, holding a glass I hadn't taken a sip from. Later that night, we gathered around the kitchen table, Richard, Carol, and Paige, with Owen nestled in her arms. They looked steady, a united line across the wood, while I stood near the counter, arms folded. Richard cleared his throat and said the move to the basement was only temporary until we figure out something more permanent. The word landed hard. "What does that mean?" I asked, though I already knew. Paige lifted her hand, smoothing Owen's blanket, and said her therapist wanted her to keep stability right now. "Owen needs consistency." I tried to keep my voice steady. "And what about my children's stability?" The only sound for a moment was the faint squeak of Owen's pacifier. Richard leaned forward, his voice calm but heavy. "Don't be dramatic, Nora. They have a roof over their heads." My chest tightened, but I reminded him, "A roof I help pay for. More than a third of the expenses." Carol and Richard exchanged a quick glance before my mother spoke. "We've been thinking it makes sense to pool all resources. Paige is rebuilding and Owen has expenses. You already have a job, your contributions stretch further." I felt my legs lock beneath me. "You've been giving my money to Paige?" I asked. Richard's hand cut through the air, brushing it aside. "Not all of it, just helping her get back on her feet." I pressed both palms flat against the table to keep steady. "While my children sleep in a basement." His jaw tightened. "If you're that unhappy, you could pitch a tent in the yard. At least then they'd have windows." The cruel line hung in the silence that followed, even Paige lowering her eyes. The next morning, Lila carried her clarinet into the living room, setting the stand near the window. She had barely raised the mouthpiece before Carol entered, finger pressed to her lips. "Not in the house, sweetheart. It wakes Owen." Lila's face fell, and she packed it away quietly, pressing the latches closed without a sound. When I asked her later why she didn't take it back out, she shrugged. "Grandma says maybe I can try something quieter next year." I had no answer. That evening, Mason hardly spoke at dinner. He picked at his plate, shoulders, rounded, eyes lowered. Usually he would tell me about his science projects or what new fact he'd learned, but now he only chewed in silence. Richard noticed me watching. "Kids are resilient," he said flatly, as if that explained everything. Later I found Mason asleep with his inhaler clutched in his hand. His breathing rasped unevenly, and on his nightstand I noticed the log he kept of its use, twice as often since the basement move. The dampness wasn't just uncomfortable, it was shaping his lungs. My chest ached as I pulled the blanket tighter over him, wondering how much longer I could pretend this was survivable. I retreated to my corner of the basement, a small space behind an old bookshelf, where I kept my own bed and opened my phone to check my balance. The extra hours were showing numbers slowly stacking high enough for me to imagine first and last month's rent. The thought of an apartment, however small, flickered in my mind as both relief and fear. Was it better to demand respect one last time, or slip away without asking? The choice weighed on me over the following days. Each moment reminded me that the house no longer carried our voices. When relatives came by, they paraded upstairs to admire Owen's nursery, the fresh paint, the new shelves, the window seat cushions Carol had sewn. "It's just what a growing boy needs," Aunt Valerie said, running her hand across the crib rail. Richard nodded toward me. "Your twins are very accommodating giving up their room." My throat tightened, the words bitter in my mouth when I finally said, "They didn't exactly have a choice." Silence followed before Carol quickly jumped in with a smile, promising the basement would be converted into a proper bedroom someday. Richard added, "After we finish the kitchen remodel, Paige needs the space for Owen's meals." That night, Mason's cough echoed louder against the basement walls. I sat by his bed, rubbing his back as he tried to steady his breath. "Is dinner ready?" he asked, his eyes heavy. "Almost," I whispered, though my mind was elsewhere. "How's your breathing?" He shrugged. "Same." I handed him water, recalling Dr. Hines' warning during our last visit about environmental triggers. Upstairs laughter erupted as Paige and my parents entertained family at the dining table. Mason glanced toward the ceiling. "I don't invite friends over anymore," he said, his voice low. I asked why. "It's embarrassing. Nobody else lives in their grandparents' basement." My chest felt like it folded in on itself. 2 days earlier, I had overheard Lila decline a sleepover with the same excuse: too much homework. She hadn't picked up her clarinet since the day my mother silenced her. I carried his dishes back upstairs and paused halfway, hearing my name drift from the dining room. Nora's running herself ragged Aunt Valerie said, 16-hour shifts can't be good for her. My mother's voice followed, even and dismissive. She needs the money. Divorced nurses don't exactly have a safety net. I stood there long enough to hear the scrape of forks and the rise of laughter again. Upstairs, I was invisible. Downstairs, my children were fading. That night in the hospital break room, Dana noticed the tremor in my hands as I set down an IV bag. She didn't ask questions, only slipped a folded paper into my pocket. "That 3-bedroom on Maple. My husband's friend owns it. It's coming open next month, but it's not listed yet." She looked at me and said quietly, "Your kids deserve windows." The paper stayed in my pocket through my shift, the weight of it more powerful than the exhaustion in my body. I drove home under streetlights and sat in the driveway longer than I meant to, the glow from inside the house spilling across the curtains. My children slept below ground. Owen's nursery light glowed warm upstairs. The walls seemed to hum with an answer I hadn't wanted to hear before, but couldn't ignore now. I pushed open the front door, my shoes quiet on the hardwood, and thought about the promise I'd written in my notebook: find sunlight. Upstairs, voices hushed as the baby shifted in his sleep. Downstairs, the damp air pressed in around every breath. For the first time, I knew I couldn't wait for the house to change. I had to. The weeks that followed blurred together, though the house carried each reminder in small ways. Mason no longer rushed to tell me about his classes or experiments, only nodding when I asked about his day. His voice had lost its lift, and when I pressed his shoulders, only rose in a shrug. At night, his cough echoed against the basement walls, steady enough to become part of the room's rhythm. He tucked his inhaler under his pillow, as if holding it close gave him more control than he truly had. Lila learned a different silence. She carried her clarinet to school, but never brought it out in the evenings, the case resting untouched on the cement shelf. One night when I walked past her bed, she had lined her sheet music neatly beside her pillow, as though order might stand in for practice. She smiled at me quickly, but I caught the way her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, measuring if her uncle's baby had stirred. That same week, she turned down a sleepover invitation, mumbling about homework she didn't have. I heard her friend's laughter through the phone before the call ended. The sound lingered long after the dial tone faded. Meals upstairs were quieter, too. Mason pushed food around his plate, while Owen babbled in his high chair, earning every smile in the room. When Mason coughed, Carol's expression tightened, and she reached to adjust Owen's bib. "Maybe you should eat downstairs tonight," she suggested softly. Mason obeyed without a word, his plate balanced carefully in both hands as he disappeared into the stairwell. Lila followed him minutes later, claiming she had forgotten her napkin. I sat still at the table, fork untouched, while Paige thanked our mother for preparing Owen's pureed squash. The basement had begun to feel like a separate household one, where whispers replaced laughter. I found Mason reading by flashlight beneath his blanket, the glow faint against the concrete walls. "Why don't you come up to the living room?" I asked gently. He shook his head, thumb holding his place in the book. "Grandma says my coughing bothers Owen." His words carried no anger, only a quiet acceptance. Something inside me shifted, then not broken, but bent hard enough to know it wouldn't return to its old shape. During Sunday dinner, Aunt Valerie broke the pattern. She set down her fork, scanning the room with her bluntness that always cut through Carol's polished small talk. "Don't the kids mind being in the basement?" Her words froze the table. Paige looked down at her plate. Carol's smile stiffened, and Richard cleared his throat. "They won't be there long," he said quickly, "just until we make more permanent plans." My pulse steadied in my ears, and before anyone else spoke, I found myself answering. "We're moving out next week." The clatter of silverware hit the table, Carol's water glass tipping and spilling across the cloth. Paige's voice rose first, disbelief sharp. "What do you mean, moving out?" Richard's face darkened like a storm rolling over the horizon. I held their eyes and spoke plainly. "I've signed a lease. 3 bedrooms in the twin school district." No one moved for several long seconds. Then Carol's voice stumbled out. "You can't just decide," I interrupted softly. "I can." Turning toward Valerie, who still held her fork suspended, I said, "Yes, they mind very much. Mason's asthma has worsened from the damp. Lila hasn't invited a friend in weeks. They deserve better." Richard leaned forward, his voice clipped. "This is about money, isn't it? We can work something out." I set my napkin neatly beside my plate. "It isn't about money. It's about respect." The room felt smaller with each word the air taut as Owen fussed in Paige's arms. That night, while the house slept, I called Dana. My voice was steadier than I expected when I asked if her offer still stood. "The guest room's small," she said, "but the couch pulls out. You'll have space until the apartment is ready." I whispered a thank you, though the weight behind it carried more than gratitude. In the silence that followed, I realized I hadn't asked for anyone's permission before making the call. The decision belonged to me. The following days I moved carefully. Between double shifts, I filled out rental applications, arranged utility transfers, and tucked away essentials in a suitcase beneath the basement bookshelf. When Mason or Lila caught me folding clothes, I only told them to keep their backpacks ready. For what Mason asked, his eyes cautious. "Just the things you need most," I answered. He nodded slowly, as if he understood more than I had said. Lila lingered by the door, her clarinet case clutched tighter than usual. Neither pressed for more. By Saturday evening, the living room upstairs buzzed with talk of Owen's upcoming half-birthday. Paige passed her phone around, showing mock-ups of cupcakes with pastel frosting, while Carol debated which photo filter best captured his smile. Richard leaned back in his chair, content with the plans laid out before him. I carried laundry through the room without pause, their voices a steady hum behind me, and slipped down the stairs to the basement. My suitcase lay open, and I slid in the last stack of folded clothes, zipping it shut with finality. When I looked up, Mason and Lila stood in the doorway, their faces holding both confusion and hope. "Pack your backpacks," I whispered. "Just what you need for a few days." Lila's eyes widened. Mason's hand eased around his inhaler less tight than usual. "Are we really leaving?" she asked, her voice barely above a breath. I nodded, surprised at the smile tugging across my face. "Yes, tonight." They didn't hesitate. Mason moved to gather his books carefully, choosing the ones he could carry, while Lila tucked sheet music between changes of clothes. I placed their grandmother's quilts on top, the fabric worn soft but comforting, and closed their bags. Upstairs, the laughter over cupcakes grew louder, spilling down the stairwell like background music to our quiet work. I met both of their eyes, lowering my voice. "Only what matters most. We'll come back for the rest later." They straightened as they listened, shoulders lifting as though a new air already filled their lungs. For the first time in months, I saw the line of their posture change, not weighed down, but steady, ready to step forward. The plan was set in motion, and each movement carried us closer to the door. The night air outside waited, and somewhere beyond it sunlight through real windows. I knew then the hardest part wasn't deciding to go. It was telling my children that this time I meant it. Dawn crept into the basement through the narrow slit of a window that barely cleared the ground outside. I stood by the packed bags, listening to Mason and Lila breathe as they slept, both curled toward the walls like they were bracing against more than the cold. Their quilts, worn thin by years of washing, looked small against the concrete backdrop. I touched Mason's shoulder gently, whispering his name until his eyes blinked open. Lila stirred, neck stretching before sitting upright, confusion shifting to realization when she saw the bags at the door. "It's time," I said softly. They nodded, no questions this time, just quiet resolve. Upstairs, the house was still my parents, not yet awake. I motioned for the kids to carry their backpacks and follow me into the early light. The driveway was damp from last night's rain, and Dana's van idled by the curb, its headlights cutting through the mist. She stepped out in her scrubs, her hair pulled back, and opened the side door without a word. Mason climbed in first, clutching his inhaler, followed by Lila, who hugged her clarinet case tight. I slid into the passenger seat, the zipper of my suitcase catching on the seatbelt buckle as Dana put the van into gear. The tires hummed against the pavement as we pulled away, the house shrinking in the rearview mirror. No one spoke for several blocks, but the silence wasn't heavy, it felt like release. Dana's guest room smelled faintly of lavender from a candle burned down to the wick. The couch unfolded neatly, its cushions stacked by the wall. It wasn't large, but it was safe, and it was ours for now. Mason and Lila helped me tuck sheets around the pullout, their movements deliberate, as though making a real bed erased the memory of concrete floors. That night, Lila propped her clarinet on the nightstand and whispered, "Tomorrow, can I practice here?" I nodded, pulling her quilt tight around her shoulders. Mason set his inhaler beside his pillow, but didn't clutch it this time. He drifted into sleep without coughing his breath steady enough that I stood listening longer than I should have. The days that followed carried a rhythm I hadn't felt in months. I worked my shifts, and each evening I came back to find my children reclaiming small pieces of themselves. Mason spread his books across the kitchen table, tracing constellations in a library guide with a steady hand. Lila filled the air with scales and short songs, her clarinet warming the small room with sound that belonged again. Dana kept her word, never asking for details, only leaving notes about dinner reheated in the oven or a bag of oranges on the counter. For the first time, I felt the edge of stability returning, even if it was temporary. Then the calls began. My phone buzzed endlessly, each voicemail more urgent than the last. Carol's voice came first, sharp with indignation. "This is inappropriate, Nora. You're traumatizing Paige by leaving like this." Owen senses the tension. "Call us immediately." Richard followed with his familiar authority. "I can't believe you'd do this to family. We need to talk." Paige's message trembled with something like betrayal. How could you walk out on us after everything I played them? Once, then silenced the phone. The kids arranged their books on a second-hand shelf Dana's husband had carried in, their laughter rising in the background. The choice between answering and ignoring was clear. By the week's end, the lease papers were signed. The apartment wasn't large, but 3 bedrooms meant Mason and Lila would finally have space to stretch without counting each other's steps. I walked through the bare rooms with them, sunlight spilling across the hardwood dust motes rising in the air like proof of something new. "This one's yours," I told Lila, pointing to the lavender-painted wall. She traced the edge of the windowsill with her finger, smiling in a way I hadn't seen for months. Mason chose the room opposite his telescope, already set in his mind by the window facing the park. That night we slept on mattresses borrowed from Dana's friend quilts, laid across them the hum of the city outside our windows instead of the rattle of basement pipes. The next morning Brenda from pediatrics arrived with a stack of curtains, her teenage daughter carrying a box of kitchen utensils. Marcus from the ER brought a television and a worn but sturdy couch, setting it down with a grin. "Donation closet magic," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. By Sunday evening, our apartment looked less like a start-over and more like a home. Mason placed his rock collection along the windowsill, humming quietly as he arranged each piece. Lila sat cross-legged on her bed, playing a soft melody that wound through the rooms, the notes bright and clear. I leaned against the doorway, listening to the music drift down the hall. Mason's cough had disappeared by then, his inhaler untouched for days. That night, as I folded laundry, my phone buzzed with a new message. This time, it wasn't my parents'. Aunt Valerie's number appeared. Her text was simple. "Your mother told everyone you had a breakdown and took the kids. Just wanted you to know what's being said. How are you really?" I sat with the phone for a moment before replying. "We're fine. The twins have their own rooms now with windows." The screen glowed with her answer minutes later. "Good. Don't let them rewrite this." More messages followed in the days ahead, extended family reaching out with support and questions. For the first time, voices outside my parents' circle were choosing to believe me. 2 weeks after we moved in, a new text appeared on my phone, this time from Richard. "We need to talk." "May I visit?" I set the phone down, watching Mason and Lila in the living room. They had built a fort from the couch cushions, their laughter spilling into the room without hesitation. The walls carried their voices easily, no one shushing them, no footsteps overhead. Whatever conversation waited with my parents, I knew it wouldn't change the truth already written in this home. 3 days later, the doorbell rang. Mason peeked through the curtain before calling me to the door. Richard and Carol stood there, Paige just behind them with Owen on her hip. Richard held a large gift bag decorated with dinosaurs, Carol's smile stiff as she adjusted Owen's blanket. I opened the door, the air shifting as they stepped inside. Richard cleared his throat. "We thought the kids might like something from home." The bag rested against the couch, its bright paper out of place in the modest room. "This is their home now," I answered quietly, my voice steady enough to carry into the silence that followed. The visit had begun, and with it a different kind of test. Their words might soften, but the ground we stood on had already shifted. Whatever came next would not return us to what had been before. It would shape what came after. Richard and Carol stepped into the apartment, their eyes taking in the secondhand furniture, and the children's drawings taped proudly to the walls. Paige followed close behind Owen, balanced on her hip, his blanket slipping down as she adjusted him. Richard set the dinosaur gift bag on the coffee table and cleared his throat. "We thought Mason and Lila might enjoy something from home." His voice was practiced, measured. I kept mine even when I answered. "This is their home now." The words hung between us, heavier than the silence that followed. Carol shifted Owen against her shoulder and gave a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "We may have been hasty with how things were arranged," she said gently. "The twins could have one of the upstairs bedrooms. We'd be willing to move some things around." I met her gaze and asked plainly, "You mean share a room instead of the basement?" Richard's stance stiffened. "It would be better than where they were." My chest tightened, but I held steady. "They already have bedrooms, with windows." Paige's voice broke into the pause, sharper than my parents' careful words. "You're punishing all of us by moving out. The twins miss their grandparents. Owen needs his aunt. How is that fair to anyone?" I looked at her, then at Mason and Lila, who had wandered into the room, their steps cautious as they saw the gathering. Lila slipped her hand into mine, while Mason stayed a few paces back, watching closely. I bent slightly toward them. Would you like to show your grandparents your new rooms?" Their faces brightened, and without waiting for permission, they led the way down the short hallway. I pushed open Lila's door first. The lavender-painted bookshelf stood by the wall, filled with her favorite books. Her clarinet stand waited near the window, where natural light pooled across the floor. She set her case down, fingers brushing the desk we had assembled together. "Perfect for practice and homework," I said softly, letting them see for themselves. Richard stayed by the doorway, his expression unreadable, while Carol looked around her hand, tightening on Owen's blanket. Across the hall, Mason stood taller as he showed his room. The blue walls glowed under the constellation stickers we had pressed onto the ceiling the week before. His telescope stood proudly by the window, aimed toward the park across the street. He glanced back at his grandparents, his voice stronger than usual. "There's a field right there. We can play soccer." Carol's eyes softened briefly, then settled back into composure. "This must be expensive," she murmured. I answered quietly, "My children aren't bargaining chips. They deserve respect the same as Owen." Back in the living room, Mason opened the pantry door for Carol, pointing to a shelf lined with snacks. "These are ours. We don't have to ask every time we're hungry." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his inhaler, holding it up. "And I don't need this much anymore since we left the basement. Dr. Hines says my lungs sound better already." Carol's mouth opened, but she stopped when she saw the steadiness in his eyes. Richard looked away, his jaw tight. Lila lifted her clarinet and assembled it quickly, her movements practiced. A stream of notes filled the apartment light, and certain echoing in ways they never could below ground. When the melody faded, the room was quiet. Paige shifted uncomfortably by the door, her phone clutched like a shield. "Who's going to watch Owen next week when I have that interview?" The words landed heavy in the silence. Lila lowered her clarinet, realization dawning across her face. I answered evenly, "I'm sure you'll figure something out. You're resourceful." Paige's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. For the first time, Richard stepped forward, helping Carol gather Owen's things instead of leaving it to Paige. Carol reminded her softly about the babysitting service they had discussed. Small shifts, but enough for me to notice. When they finally prepared to leave, Richard lingered at the threshold. "Nora, could I speak with you alone?" I hesitated, catching Mason and Lila's eyes before nodding. On the balcony, the chill cut through the air, the hum of the street below, steady and distant. Richard looked out at the view, the trees beyond the parking lot, then turned back to me. "We may not have handled things the right way," he said slowly. "But I hope this doesn't mean we lose our place in their lives." His words weren't polished, but they carried something real beneath them. I met his gaze, steady but cautious. "That depends on whether you can accept the life we've built here." Through the glass door, I watched Mason showing Carol the view from the apartment window, his hand pointing toward the patch of park where kids were already gathering with a soccer ball. Carol nodded faintly, her face unreadable. Inside, Lila rearranged her music sheets on the desk, her back straight, shoulders unbowed. For the first time, the weight of the moment didn't rest entirely on me. It was visible in my children's posture, in their voices, in the space they claimed as theirs. The visit ended quietly, but its edges lingered. Their words had softened, but the balance had shifted. This time it was not me asking for a place. It was them learning to stand on the outside of what we had created. I closed the door after them, the lock clicking softly behind. Mason and Lila stood in the hallway waiting. Lila's clarinet rested against her leg. Mason's telescope gleamed in the light from his window. I looked at both of them and knew the hardest battles weren't the ones fought loudest. They were the ones where we chose to stand still and not give back the ground we had claimed. The quiet settled around us, but it didn't feel empty. It felt like the start of something different, a line drawn not with anger, but with certainty. I didn't know what my parents would do next, but I knew what we had to protect. And I knew, too, that the next steps would bring choices I couldn't put off much longer. The air in the apartment still carried their presence even after the door closed. Mason leaned against the hallway wall, arms folded, while Lila set her clarinet back in its case. I stood quietly for a moment, listening to the sounds that had settled into our new home. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint music drifting from a neighbor's window, the rustle of pages as Mason opened one of his science books again. It was different from the hush of my parents' house, and it steadied me. The next morning, sunlight stretched across the kitchen table where the kids sat finishing cereal. My phone buzzed with a message from the hospital administrator. The charge nurse position was still open if I wanted to discuss. I stared at the screen, my spoon balanced over the bowl. The role would bring better pay, steadier hours, and more responsibility. Lila looked up. "Are you going to take it?" she asked softly. I set the phone down, meeting her eyes. "I'm thinking about it." Mason glanced up too, and for a brief moment I saw something in both of them, hope that I was no longer choosing between survival and standing still. That weekend, Dana arrived with 2 coworkers from the hospital. Joanne, who always carried a kind smile, hauled in a small desk for Mason's room, while Marcus lugged a second-hand couch up the stairs. "Families leave good things behind all the time," Marcus said, brushing his hands. "Might as well make use of them." By Sunday night, the apartment looked like a place meant for us. Curtains hung in Lila's room matched her quilt, and Mason arranged his rock collection along the new shelf. I sank into the couch, the kids leaning on either side of me, the television flickering for the first time in months. Carol's voice reached me again that evening, this time through Aunt Valerie. My aunt's text appeared on the screen. "Your mother told everyone you had a breakdown and kidnapped the kids. Just wanted you to know." "How are you really?" My fingers hovered before I typed back. "We're fine. The twins each have their own bedroom now with windows." The reply came quick. "Good. Don't let them rewrite it." Other messages followed, cousins checking in, one offering help with furniture. For the first time in years, family voices arrived without judgment attached. 2 weeks after the visit, another message appeared, this time from Richard. "We need to talk." "May I visit?" I read it twice, then set the phone aside. Across the room, Mason was sprawled on the rug, building a model volcano for science class. Lila practiced quietly in her room, the notes trailing down the hall with easy confidence. I knew what Richard wanted, but I also knew the answer would come only when I was ready. When they arrived again, their expressions carried less authority than before. Carol cradled Owen as always, but her steps were slower. Paige hung back, her phone in hand, though this time she didn't look defiant, she looked unsettled. Richard carried a toolbox instead of a gift bag, his eyes flicking briefly toward the shelves stacked neatly with books and games. Mason stood tall by the window, pointing to the park across the street, as if inviting them to see what he saw. Lila placed her clarinet on its stand, smiling faintly as she prepared to play. Richard cleared his throat once more. "We've been talking. The twins could have a room upstairs again if you'd come back. We could make adjustments." I looked past him toward my children. Mason touched the telescope by his window. "I can see the moon from here," he said proudly. Lila lifted her clarinet and began to play the melody, filling every corner of the apartment. Richard's words faded under the sound, replaced by something far stronger proof that the kids had already claimed this place as their own. When the last note lingered, I turned back to my parents. "This situation works for us. They're respected here." Paige stepped forward, her voice sharper than before. "You're punishing us. Owen needs his aunt, and I need your help." I held her gaze evenly. "You'll manage. You're capable." Carol looked away, bouncing Owen gently while Richard's grip tightened on the toolbox. The old authority was gone, replaced by hesitation. They left not long after, though. Richard paused at the door again. "I'd like to come by sometime to help with shelves," he said quietly, "if you'll let me." His voice carried no command, only an offering. I nodded once, keeping my answer simple. "We'll see." That night, the apartment glowed with a quiet steadiness. Mason polished the telescope lens, Lila reorganized her music sheets, and I opened the message about the charge nurse position once more. The kids didn't look up as I began filling out the application, but I felt their calm settle in the room. Whatever storms might come next, the ground beneath us was different now. We weren't asking for a place, we had made one, and as I turned out the light in the hallway, I knew the next shift would bring changes I could no longer postpone. 6 months later, the papers lay spread across the desk in front of me, each page waiting for my signature. The loan officer slid the pen across with a smile. "Congratulations, Ms. Bennett. You're a homeowner." The cool weight of the house keys pressed into my palm as I thought back to the basement steps where my nursing bag had landed that night. Damp walls, cobwebbed corners, and the sound of pipes had once framed my children's lives. Now sunlight cut across a modest 3-bedroom filled with promise. Brenda's text arrived as I stepped into the hallway. "We still on for Saturday, I'll bring a fern." I smiled before answering yes. At work, my badge now read, "Charge Nurse." Doctors consulted me on difficult cases. Nurses came to me with scheduling questions. I no longer kept my head down. I stood steady in the role, each decision marked by confidence I hadn't felt in years. That evening, Mason spread his science project across the dining table, a volcano lined with foil and clay. His cheeks flushed as he explained how it would erupt. Beside him, Lila played a full piece on her clarinet, filling the kitchen with sound. Neither looked startled when I walked in. They finished what they were doing first, proud of it, and then looked up with easy smiles. "Principal Hayes asked me to join advanced band," Lila said, polishing her mouthpiece. Mason leaned forward, his eyes shining. "Mrs. Clark says my project might win first place." His voice carried excitement, not hesitation. They both asked almost in unison, "Can we paint our rooms this weekend?" Lila wanted lavender. Mason wanted a real blue, not the faded shade he remembered from my mother's basement walls. I promised we would. Their laughter rose. As paint swatches spread across the table, Mason already planning constellations for his ceiling, Lila debating where her posters should go. The phone rang later that night. My mother's number glowed on the screen. I answered after the third ring. Her voice sounded different, measured, almost tentative. "We'd like you and the twins to come for Sunday dinner next week," she said. "Your father's grilling steaks." I asked directly. "Just us?" She hesitated before answering. "Yes, Paige moved back to her condo last month. Owen's nursery is empty now." I took a breath and said, "We'll come, but we'll need to leave early. Lila has band practice Monday morning. The old me would have rearranged everything for them. This time, I set the terms." "That's fine," she said quietly. On Saturday, our small home filled with people who had stood beside us when we needed it most. Brenda carried in a potted fern, placing it in the corner with a grin. Joanne brought a welcome mat, while Marcus carried in a dish of lasagna, joking about how his hands were better suited for lifting furniture than cooking. We raised glasses that evening, Brenda's words carrying through the room. To finding family in unexpected places. I blinked back tears that didn't come from pain this time. Mason's face lit up as he gave tours of his room, showing off his telescope. Lila beamed as she led them to her lavender walls clarinet resting by the window. Later, as laughter lingered in the air, a knock sounded at the door. I opened it to find Richard standing there, a toolbox in his hand. He looked at the paint-speckled jeans I still wore, and then at the bookshelves leaning against the wall. "Thought you might need help mounting those," he said. His eyes didn't carry the same authority as before, only something quieter. He set the toolbox down carefully. "I'm proud of you, Nora." The words landed in the air, unfamiliar and fragile. I nodded, not answering right away, only watching him as he glanced toward Mason and Lila, both laughing in the next room. The evening drew on the children still painting their hands, as much as their walls' music rising faintly from Lila's clarinet. I stood in the kitchen, the fern bright in the corner, and thought about what it meant to repair bonds without surrendering ground. My father's words were tentative, my mother's tone careful, but the shift was undeniable. They were learning to stand at the edges of what we had built, no longer at its center. The night closed with the sound of Mason's laughter carrying down the hall, Lila's clarinet trailing behind him. For the first time, their voices rose without restraint, filling every corner. I leaned against the doorway, steady in the knowledge that justice had already begun to take its shape. But I also knew the question still waiting, the one I could not answer yet. How much of what had been broken could ever be rebuilt? The night after my father showed up with his toolbox, I sat at the kitchen table long after the kids had gone to bed. The fern Brenda had given us stood in the corner, its leaves brushing the wall, steady and green. The shelves Richard had helped me mount held the beginnings of a library. Mason's science books, Lila's music binders, and a few novels I hadn't touched since before the divorce. I looked around the small house and realized it wasn't just ours, it was us. Every wall carried our effort, every corner held our voices. The next weeks passed in a way I had once thought impossible. The children adjusted to school without hesitation, bringing friends over after class without apology. Mason's cough disappeared completely, his inhaler used only when the weather shifted sharply. Lila practiced daily, her music filling the house with confidence instead of caution. On Sundays, we sometimes joined Richard and Carol for dinner, but it was different now. I chose the time, I set the limits, and they respected that. Paige stayed mostly quiet, her visits short, her focus on Owen. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a guest in my own family. One evening after a long shift, I came home to find the kids painting handprints on the basement wall of our new house, the one I had signed for with my own name. Blue lavender and green prints overlapped in a playful pattern, a mural of belonging. Lila laughed when she smeared paint on Mason's arm, and he chased her across the room, both of them shouting through their joy. I leaned in the doorway watching, remembering how their shoulders had once hunched low in my parents' basement, how their voices had softened to whispers. Now they filled the air without restraint. When Richard visited again, he stood quietly by the doorframe, watching the mural take shape. His hands stayed at his sides, no toolbox in sight. "They look happy here," he said finally. I nodded, not with defiance, but with calm. "They are." He didn't argue, didn't try to reason. He only stepped back and said, "I'll call before I come next time." That small sentence carried more change than years of speeches. As spring turned to summer, I began taking online classes toward my nurse practitioner's degree. Each evening after dinner, I studied at the kitchen table, while the kids worked on their own projects beside me. Mason sketched plans for a new science fair entry, while Lila rehearsed her clarinet solos. Sometimes I looked up from my screen and caught them smiling at me, their eyes filled with trust. The weight of those looks steadied me more than any paycheck or title. On the day Lila performed with her advanced band, Richard and Carol sat quietly in the audience. They clapped when she finished, their applause genuine, though they didn't rush to claim credit for her talent. Mason won first place for his volcano project that same month. He held the ribbon high, his grin wide, as he ran toward me in the crowd. "See, Mom, I told you it would work." The ribbon may have been his, but the moment belonged to all of us. Standing in that auditorium, surrounded by voices cheering for my children, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or dramatic reckonings. Sometimes it's in the quiet, when your child breathes freely, when music rises without apology, when a home carries laughter instead of silence. Sometimes justice is simply giving those you love the space to grow without having to prove they deserve it. Now, when I unlock the door to our house, I don't think about what we left behind. I think about what we built, the windows filled with morning light, the walls marked by handprints, the sound of my children's laughter echoing across every room. We didn't just find sunlight, we made it. And if you've ever had to fight for a place where your voice or your family could truly belong, then you understand. Justice doesn't always look like revenge. Sometimes it's a life lived on your own terms with dignity and love guiding the way. Before you go, I'd love to know, have you ever had to choose your own peace over someone else's comfort? Share your story in the comments, and if this journey stayed with you, remember to follow along for more.